Hi everybody, this is Karl with Prairie Creek Seed. I'm going to be talking in this PowerPoint video about considerations for pasture management or grazing management. I know there are a lot of different strategies and a lot of different thoughts, but there are some principles that remain the same. And as a grazer myself, it can really be helpful to keep in mind that there's no one way to go about grazing. Whenever we make a change in our management, and in this case I'm talking about changing pasture management, we need to look at the benefits of making these changes. And if you're seriously considering starting to get heavier into grasslands management, intensive grazing, I would take an assessment of where you're at right now. And that way you can have a record of it. So in the future, you can see where you've been and how much progress you've actually made. Because there might be days when you feel like you're not making any progress. Looking at the reasons to make a change, and I look at someone that's trying to expand livestock numbers but are landlocked, and that might not be everywhere, but here in the Midwest, that's real relevant. Or looking to bring back a family member back to the farm. And then the performance of the livestock in general, whether it be weaning heavier calves, if you're a dairy, more milk production, if you're a cow-calf operation, having more cows bred at the end of the season or better body condition scores coming into the fall. If you're grass-based livestock and you're finishing, quicker finishing. And then there's always the soil health and the stewardship of the land aspect of managing pastures. That all of these actually bring us up to number one, and that is when profit is important. If we can improve all of those below, we know we're going to add or help on our bottom line. When putting together your grazing plan or strategy for the summer, there's some considerations that I think you should look at. Number one is what kind of diet would be needed for the class of livestock that you're grazing. The nutritional requirements are going to be different for a stocker or a cow-calf or a grazing dairy. So you're going to want to manage your pastures to get the optimum diet for the livestock that you are grazing. And this could actually be a combination of grazing strategies. That's why I don't like to just call grazing management and put it into a box. One of the terms I do like is adaptive grazing, and I use intentional grazing a lot because that gives you flexibility, because there's not just one single cookie cutter strategy for grazing. It's going to change throughout the year. You look at trying to manage the seasonality of pastures. We have a lot of excess growth in the spring, and then in the summer a lot of times we'll have a slump where the cool season grasses aren't growing. So that grazing strategy, does it include harvesting some of the excess grass in the spring to feed later, or does it include having warm seasons, annuals that you can be grazing in the summer? There's two principles that I have on here that I feel are important in that decision-making process. And one of them is to make sure that the forages that you've been grazing have fully recovered before you return to graze them. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but giving those plants adequate time to fully recover. And then our grazing management, our goal is to build our organic matter or humus, and also have our nutrient cycle fully charged and working. And our grazing management will affect that as well. In order to build organic matter and also increase our forage yields, plants need to continue to grow. And I'm not talking just above ground, but I'm also talking below ground. I wanted to show this picture of 4 different grass plants and how much was clipped off and actually what it did to the root systems. So even though you may have a pasture it doesn't necessarily mean that you are building organic matter. And if you look closely at it's the first picture, then the second picture, we have more root growth. The third picture is 50% removal, and we've still got adequate root system there to help build organic matter. And then here to the far left, that root mass, of course, it hasn't been grazed, so we're not getting a lot of utilization, but that shows you how much root mass that these grasses will put down. To me, it's just amazing to look at those pictures and the differences in the amount of root growth. The chart, you can look that over, but really, once we remove 50% of the upper plant, we stop a high percentage of the root growth down below. And once we stop that root growth, before we can start growing above ground forage again, those roots have to take back off as well. And sometimes we can stop the top growth for over 2 weeks by grazing it too short. And that's where we're going to increase our forage yield, is if we have that root mass in order to be able to feed the above ground portion of that plant. We can really overcomplicate pasture management or grazing management. There's a lot of different strategies for grazing. There's a lot of good speakers out there with a lot of great ideas. Sometimes I think we can be overwhelmed with all the information out there and really not get started. I do have a handful of suggestions here that I believe will help increase your forage yield. It'll help maintain your diversity of your pasture, and it'll help improve the soil health. The number one rule is don't overgraze the pasture. Just simply let those plants fully recover before you come back and graze it again. I talked about the 4-leaf rule earlier, and I think that's a great starting point, especially if you have cool season pastures, grass pastures. Leave a 4-inch stubble. We want to leave some green material out there to collect the sunlight so those plants can start regrowing without pulling off a lot of their root reserves. The next one would be keep livestock on a pasture no more than 4 days. Once we get into 5 days and 6 days, we're starting to regrow on those plants. And if the livestock come back and graze it again, now we're going to have to pull off of our root reserves to start growing again. Keep compaction to a minimum. Livestock do tend, especially in the upper Midwest, we'll have a month of really moist soils. And as they're out walking around, they are going to tighten the soils. Generally, it's in the top 1 to 2 inches. And I joke sometimes the soils may actually have an iron deficiency to where it might be best to come in with something like a yeoman plow or an airway. Yetter Manufacturing used to make a pasture renovation coulter. Sometimes in order to reboot, I feel that would be a good option. If we have a lot of plant diversity, and especially over time, that helps very much. But especially at the beginning stages of starting to manage pastures, it might be such a thing that you would want to go out and run an airway or something to break up that top cap. There's hundreds of different ways to manage pastures. I said earlier I like the term adaptive or intentional grazing. The key to me is to be flexible, to always be looking ahead and how much forage that you have currently, how fast you're going through it, so that you can plan and maybe make changes so that you don't end up getting into a spot where you run out of pasture. And if you do, this is probably would be one of the top 4 rules as well. Take the cows off, even if you have to put them in a dry lot, and feed them hay while your pastures wait to recover. Because if you have your livestock out on a dormant pasture and they're going to continue to graze it short, when you do get rain, it's going to take a very long time for it to recover and start to regrow. those are just a few things that I feel would really benefit you to work on when you do start a grazing management plan. And once again, thank you very much. And if you do have any questions or want to visit with us, give us a call or email us. I appreciate it very much, and thank you.